The story you are about to hear is about a brave Viking warrior, Bjorn Erickson, a man who once ruled over entire Denmark but in a tragic event becomes desperate to return home. Could Bjorn go home? Let's find out. Roughly around 790 AD, after the Great Ivar, Bjorn Erickson inherits the crown of Denmark. At a young age of 16, he duels with Histritvis, a nominee to the throne, and defeats him. Bjorn rules Denmark smoothly for the following years. The Vikings were happy to invade Russia and France during the summers, but Bjorn was not satisfied with that. He wanted to fulfill his father's dream, to invade and rule England. So he starts preparing. Fortunately, he had his best friend Floki, a famous boat builder. They were together working on a boat that could withstand the voyage to England. The North Sea was known to have some of the most violent tides. Floki was skilled enough to make a perfect boat for the voyage. In return, Bjorn had promised him to wed his sister Helga with him. Floki and Helga were fond of each other since childhood. After the unfortunate death of King Ivar, Bjorn's mother Erica ruled the kingdom for a few years until Bjorn became strong. Now, she just wanted him to stay in the land and rule it, but Bjorn had different plans in his mind. One day, Erica asks him if he would drop his plan if she arranges a wedding with the French princess who was renowned for her beauty. Bjorn chuckles and replies that his father's last wish seems more beautiful to him than any woman. Erica cries, thinking her son would meet the same end as her husband. Helga asks Bjorn if the boat is ready. Bjorn smiles and replies to her that Floki is working day and night on it. He tells her that his dedication towards the boat shows his affection for her. Helga blushes and goes back inside their house. The next morning, a few merchant boats docks at the ports of Ribe. A foreign merchant steps out of it and asks the locals where the boy king is. Two Vikings takes the merchant to Bjorn. There at the courthouse, the merchant introduces himself as Thomas from England. Bjorn's eyes glitters up. It was the first time an English merchant had come to a Viking land on his own. Bjorn controls his emotions and asks Thomas why he was there. Thomas explains to Bjorn that England is currently a land divided by petty kings who fight amongst themselves rather than guarding their shores. He describes the great monastery of Lindisfarne, claiming that its walls are lined with gold and silver that the monks value more than their own lives. This news makes Bjorn's blood race with excitement, as the prospect of both wealth and the fulfillment of his father's legacy was too tempting to ignore. But first he asks Thomas why he is telling him that. Thomas smiles and replies that over a small matter, the King of Wessex butchered his entire family and expelled him from the kingdom, so he seeks revenge from him. Bjorn sees this merchant not as a stranger, but as a messenger from the gods delivered directly to his gates. However, the excitement in the court is quickly dampened by the shadow of a family conflict that follows. Queen Erica stands and openly criticizes her son's ambition, arguing that the crown he wears is a responsibility to the people of Denmark, not a medium to roam around the seas in search of ghosts. She warns him that the English fog swallows men whole, and that if he leaves a kingdom vulnerable to the vengeful families of those he defeated to take the throne. The tension grows when Helga enters the fray. Her eyes were red from weeping. She begs Bjorn to reconsider his decision, not for her own sake, but for the sake of the kingdom's future. She fears that if Bjorn and Floki both perish in the depths of the North Sea, there will be no one left to protect the women and children from the enemies. Despite the heavy atmosphere of dread in the Great Hall, the work at the deck continues. Bjorn spends his days watching Floki build his dream boat. Floki uses a method where the oak planks of the hull are overlapped and secured with iron rivets, creating a vessel that is both incredibly strong and flexible enough to dance upon the violent waves rather than breaking against them. The ship features a true T-shaped keel, a revolutionary design that provides the stability needed to support a massive square sail while maintaining a shallow draft. This shallow draft becomes Viking's greatest technological advantage, as it allows the heavy warship to sail directly onto sandy beaches or deep into narrow river systems where traditional heavy ships cannot go. And then Floki shows Bjorn the secret of the sunstone. He explains how this crystal can locate the sun even when it is hidden behind thick mist or below the horizon, ensuring they never lose their heading. This combination of structural flexibility, speed, and navigational precision gives Bjorn the confidence to ignore his mother's warnings. That night, Bjorn announces about his mission in the Great Hall and asks the Vikings to join him for that glorious purpose. Some laughed at him as they thought England is just a legend and not real, but many chose to believe him. A total of 112 Vikings agrees to sail with him. Floki prepares a total of 6 huge boats of the same design for the men over the next few months. As the day of departure arrived, the air in Ribe was thick with the scent of salt and the sound of hammers. The final family confrontation occurs on the departure day at the port. Erica refuses to give her blessing, standing silent and cold as the warriors load their shields onto the sides of the ships. Helga finds Floki near the mast and gives him a small amulet for protection, her hands trembling as she realizes this might be the last time she touches him. Bjorn stands near the boats. He tells his mother that a king who does not expand his borders is merely a caretaker of a dying land. He believes that the risk of the voyage is the only way to truly secure the Erickson name in the sagas of their people. Erica replies to him that she wishes for him to be as brave as his father, but it frightens her to think about the end he will have if he walks in that path. Bjorn kisses her on the forehead and tells his shield-maiden mother to take care of Denmark while he is away. With a final command, he orders the oarsmen to take their positions. The boats with the iconic Viking dragon heads penetrates into the sea waves swiftly. Bjorn does not look back at the shrinking figures of his mother and sister, fearing that his heart would change. His eyes were fixed solely on the west, where the promise of England and the ghost of his father awaited him. The journey across the North Sea tests every inch of Floki's craftsmanship. The waves rise like mountains, crashing against the wooden hull with a force that would shatter any normal boat. Bjorn remains standing at the front, his hand gripping the dragon's neck, feeling the ship flex and bend exactly as Floki promised it would. The warriors on board stays determined as well. Thomas the merchant sits among them, looking pale and out of place in his fine English wool clothes. But he continues to whisper directions to Bjorn about the tides. Even in the midst of the storm, Bjorn feels a sense of peace that he never felt while sitting on the throne in Denmark. To him, the crashing waves and the howling wind are the true music. He knows that back home, his mother is likely praying to the old gods for his safe return, but his heart was now claimed by the land that lies beyond the horizon. Floki's front design allows them to cut through the water with a speed that no English vessel could match, turning the vast, terrifying ocean into a road. As the mist finally begins to clear after days of travel, a thin green line appears on the horizon. Thomas points a trembling finger toward the land, confirming that they have reached the shores of England. Bjorn feels a surge of triumph inside of him. He has done what his mother said was impossible and what his father died trying to achieve. He hugs Floki with teary eyes and then calls for the men to sharpen their axes and prepare for battle. With the sunstone confirming their position and the sturdy oak of the ship holding firm, Bjorn Erickson prepares to step off the boat and into the history books, leaving the boy king behind to become the conqueror his father always knew he could be. The Vikings roars and thumps on the boat with glory and chants of Valhalla. Floki starts praying to Odin for their victory. When the 6 ships reach the shores of Northumbria, they are met by a small company of English coastal guards. The Vikings leaves their ships and forms a tight shield wall on the sand. The English soldiers, armed with light spears and round wooden shields, attempt to push the invaders back into the sea. However, the Viking warriors were superior in close-quarters combat. Bjorn leads the charge, his heavy iron axe shattering the brittle spears of the defenders. The Vikings uses their axes to hook the tops of the English shields, pulling them down to expose the men behind them and then slash them. The battle is short and one-sided. The English guards get slaughtered within minutes. Bjorn feels invincible after this first victory on the English land. He turns to Thomas, who was pointing towards the interior of the country and promises that a much larger treasure lies just a few miles away. Encouraged by their easy win, the Vikings marches inland, leaving the safety of their ships behind. They moves through narrow valleys and dense forests, confident that no English force can stand against them. Bjorn notices that Thomas is constantly trailing behind. He asks him to come forward. On their way, he tells Thomas that he has helped them greatly, and for that he will be rewarded. Bjorn tells Thomas that a true Viking always keeps his word. Thomas smiles and nods. His expression slightly changes into a grin as soon as Bjorn looks away. Bjorn asks him how far the church is. Thomas replies that they are almost there, but as the Vikings emerge into a wide clearing, they realizes that they have walked into a trap. Waiting for them was a massive troop of English soldiers, far larger and better equipped than the guards on the beach. The King of Wessex has arrived with his professional housecarls. The English utilize defensive technology that catches the Vikings off guard. They have dug hidden trenches filled with sharpened stakes and constructed portable wooden barricades. As the Vikings charge, the English unleashes a hail of arrows from longbows. These arrows were tipped with hardened steel points capable of piercing Viking chainmails easily. It was something they had never seen in their lives. The Vikings tries to form a shield wall, but the English uses a sophisticated tactic, alternating between heavy armed charges and archers to break the Viking rhythm. While the Vikings rely on individual bravery, the English worked as a coordinated unit, using long pikes to keep Bjorn's men at a distance. The Viking axes, which were so effective on the beach, could not even reach the English soldiers behind their wall of pikes and barricades. Bjorn watches in horror as his men are picked off one by the superior range of the English weapons. In the middle of the slaughter, Bjorn looks for Thomas to find a way out. He sees the cunning merchant standing on a hill behind the English lines, protected by the king's personal guards. Thomas was holding a heavy purse of gold and laughing as he watched the Vikings fall. It becomes clear that Thomas was a double agent sent to lure the Viking king into a killing field. He had never intended to help Bjorn. Rather, he just wanted the bounty placed on the famous Viking's head. The battle turns into a desperate retreat. Bjorn and a handful of survivors, including a badly wounded Floki, tries to fight their way back towards the coast. The English cavalry, a technology the Vikings rarely encounter in such numbers, sweeps in from the flanks to cut off their escape. Bjorn realizes that his mother's warnings were true. He had mastered the sea and the boat, but he had failed to understand the land and the nature of men. By the time the sun begins to set, only a fraction of the Viking force had remained. The 6 ships on the beach were being burned by English scouts, the smoke rising into the sky as a signal of Bjorn's failure. Thomas walks down to the edge of the marsh where the remaining Vikings were hiding and tells Bjorn that the Erickson bloodline will end in the mud of England. Bjorn stands in the freezing water, his sword broken and his pride shattered. He has no way home, no ships to carry him, and no allies left in this strange, hostile country. Bjorn looks at Floki. Floki grunts. He did not want to give up after coming all the way there. Bjorn asks the remaining Vikings if they want to die like a coward or fight till the last breath and sip ale beside Odin and Thor in Valhalla. The Vikings roars and stands up again. All of them charges at the archers. The archers sees them coming and start shooting arrows. The Vikings takes the arrows to their chest bravely and shields Bjorn and Floki. Bjorn and Floki reaches to the 4 archers and in a close combat cuts them open. But by that time, the whole English fleet had circled both the last standing Vikings. They binds Bjorn and Floki in heavy iron chains to take them to the king. They are taken to a dark stone dungeon beneath a fortress in Wessex. The walls were damp and the air was thick with the smell of rot. Bjorn, who once ruled over the vast lands of Denmark, now finds himself in a space no larger than the storage chest of a longship. The English guards throw stones more than bread loaves each day. The orders were to just keep them alive. The physical toll of imprisonment was immediate. Bjorn's muscles, conditioned for rowing and fighting, begins to shrink in the stillness of the cell. Floki's wounds from the battle festers in the unsanitary conditions. Because the English used advanced stone masonry for their prisons, there was no wooden door to kick down and no earth to dig through. The floor and walls were solid rock, cold enough to sap the heat from their bodies during the long nights. Bjorn watches Floki grow weaker and feels a crushing sense of guilt. He realizes that his ambition has not only led his men to their demise, but has placed his best friend and his sister's love in a cage. Thomas visits them frequently, but not to offer mercy. He comes to mock them, standing on the other side of the bars in his fine silks. He informs Bjorn that the King of Wessex is taking his time deciding how to execute them. Thomas explains that the king wants to use their deaths as a political statement to discourage other Viking raiders. He tells Bjorn that back in Denmark, rumors are already spreading that he is dead. He describes how rival lords are likely circling Queen Erica like wolves, waiting to tear the kingdom apart. This psychological pressure had always been part of the English strategy to break the spirit of their prisoners before the physical execution begins. The Vikings try to maintain their dignity by reciting the sagas of their ancestors, but the darkness of the dungeon makes it difficult to keep track of time. They lose the ability to tell day from night. Floki, despite his fever, begins to study the cell with the eye of a builder. He notices that the English ironwork in the door hinges was brittle. He explains to Bjorn in whispers that the iron was likely cooled too quickly, making it prone to snapping if hit with enough concentrated force. However, they had no tools in there, and their hands were bound. They are forced to endure weeks of isolation, listening to the muffled sounds of the bustling English castle above them, a constant reminder of the world they can no longer reach. As the weeks turn into months, the king's guards begin to use Bjorn and Floki as entertainment for the local nobility. They drags them into the great hall, still in their chains, to be mocked during feasts. The English look at them as if they are wild animals rather than royalties of a land. During one of these sessions, Bjorn notices the layout of the castle. He sees the heavy wooden pulleys used to lift supplies, and he also notices the way the torches are positioned along the walls. He realizes that the English rely heavily on their structural organization, and if that organization is disrupted, then a path to escape might open for them. The struggle becomes one of endurance. Bjorn forces himself to exercise in the cell, using the weight of his own chains to gain back those muscles. He encourages Floki to stay awake, fearing that if the shipbuilder falls into a deep sleep, he will never wake up. They talk about the tides of the North Sea and the smell of the pine forests in Ribe to keep their minds from snapping. The English captors were surprised by the resilience of the Northmen. They were expecting them to beg for more mercy, but instead, Bjorn's eyes remained sharp, tracking every movement of the guards and every turn of the key in the lock. Thomas eventually brings news that the king has reached a decision. Bjorn and Floki are to be moved to a coastal fortress where they will be executed publicly in front of the next wave of Viking ships as a warning. The journey to the coast was another test of their will. They were placed in a wooden cage on the back of a cart. The English roads were bumpy and narrow, and the villagers threw stones at them as they passed through the countryside. Bjorn remains upright, staring ahead with a cold, terrifying gaze that unnerves the guards. At the age of 21, he had already seen hell. No emotions left inside of him, just a desperation to return home. While they were held in the coastal outpost, the conditions were even harsher. The cell was located near the sea, and high tide often floods the floor with freezing salt water. This was a deliberate tactic to weaken their resolve. However, the sight of the ocean gives the Vikings a renewed sense of hope. They could smell the salt air and hear the gulls, sounds that remind them of home. Floki notices that the salt water was accelerating the rust on their iron shackles. He begins to rub the links of his chains against a sharp edge of stone every time the guards are not looking, using the natural corrosive power of the sea to do the work that his bare hands cannot. The drama of their imprisonment reaches a breaking point when Thomas reveals the final part of his betrayal. He tells Bjorn that with the king's permission, he has sent word to the slave traders, offering to sell Bjorn and Floki at some finest prices. He intends to profit from Bjorn's life one last time before his death. This news ignites a fire in Bjorn. He realizes that if he dies in that cage, his mother and sister will be left at the mercy of the men who paid Thomas for his head. He looks at Floki, whose fingers were raw and bleeding from working at the chains, and they shares a silent understanding. They were no longer just prisoners. They were survivors waiting for the one mistake the English will inevitably make. The guards become complacent, assuming that the two starving, shackled men are no longer a threat. They do not see the way Bjorn has memorized the timing of the guard shifts or the way Floki has weakened the structural integrity of their chains. The struggle of the last few months strips away everything except their will to survive. As the night of their scheduled execution approaches, the storm clouds gather over the English Channel, mirroring the darkness that has grown inside Bjorn Erickson. He is ready to turn his prison into a battlefield, even if he has to fight his way out with nothing but the broken links of his own chains. Bjorn and Floki manage to break their rusted chains during a heavy rainstorm. They then overpowers a distracted guard and slips out into the muddy fields surrounding the fortress. However, their freedom lasts only a few minutes. Weakened by months of starvation and lacking any knowledge of the local geography, English hounds easily tracks them. A troop of mounted soldiers surrounds them before they could reach the tree line. Instead of being executed on the spot, they are dragged back to the capital and brought before King Edward this time. The meeting with King Edward takes place in a large, cold stone hall. Unlike the soldiers, the king was a man of books and quiet contemplation. He does not scream at Bjorn. Instead, he asks why a man who already has a kingdom would risk everything to burn another man's home. The king orders everyone else to leave the hall. His advisor tell him to be careful around a pagan animal. Edward replies that he will be okay. Then begins a long philosophical debate between the two kings. King Edward argues that the Viking way of life is a cycle of chaos that leaves nothing behind but ashes. He speaks about the permanence of stone, the rule of law, and the Christian God who values peace. Bjorn counters by saying that a king's duty is to provide for his people, and in the harsh north, that requires strength and expansion. He tells Edward that the English are not peaceful by choice, but because they have grown soft behind their walls. The debate lasts for hours. Edward is fascinated by Bjorn's intelligence, as earlier he thought he is just a barbaric, dumb ruler. But he now understands that Vikings are even more dangerous as they give their actions a purpose. So, he decides to tame him. He tells Bjorn that he will not make him a martyr by executing him, nor will he let him go back to Denmark to plan another raid. Instead, Edward decides to strip Bjorn of his identity entirely. He decides to sell both Bjorn and Floki to a slave trader named Silas, a man known for his cruelty and his business of providing labor for the most dangerous mines in the West. To the king, this is a more poetic punishment. The man who wanted to own England will now be owned by one of its lowest citizens. Silas was a man who cared only about profit. He places Bjorn and Floki in a slave market, a long line of prisoners connected by heavy neck collars. The march towards the mines was brutal. Anyone who slows down got whipped, and the food was even worse than what they received in the dungeon. It was during this time that Bjorn notices a young woman among the slaves. She stands out because, despite her tattered clothes and the dirt on her face, she carries herself with a quiet dignity that reminds Bjorn of the nobles back in his own court. Her name was Alara. Bjorn eventually finds a chance to speak with her during a rest period. He asks her, how can she be so calm in a place like that? Alara looks at him with her beautiful blue eyes and replies that panicking wouldn't help her. Then, after talking to her for a while, Bjorn learns that Alara has a hidden origin. She was once the daughter of a minor lord from a northern territory that Silas had raided years ago. She has survived the slave camps by keeping her heritage a secret, knowing that Silas would sell her to a far worse place if he knew she was of noble blood. Bjorn was feeling some sort of attraction towards her. Watching her gave him a ray of hope again. The following days, Bjorn and Floki becomes close with her. The slave camp was a place of endless labor. Bjorn and Floki were forced to haul heavy stones from a quarry from sunrise to sunset. Silas takes a particular interest in breaking Bjorn's spirit, but Bjorn does not break that easily. Watching his resilience, the other slaves there starts admiring him. Silas soon realizes that Bjorn is the unofficial leader of the slaves and makes a point of punishing Bjorn for the mistakes of others. Despite the constant abuse, Bjorn's feelings for Alara grows. One night in the sleeping chamber, Bjorn sneaks into Alara's blanket quietly. She first freaks out to feel his body behind her, but then composes herself. Bjorn whispers in her ears that he has fallen in love with her. Alara asks him what future he can promises her with the chains around his neck. Bjorn comes closer and grabs her waist and replies that he can make her a queen again. Bjorn promises her that he is not just a slave, but a king, and that he will find a way to take her back to the north with him. Floki, meanwhile, uses his mind to observe the camp's infrastructure. He notices that Silas relies on a very specific routine for his guards, and that the quarry tools, while old, can be used as weapons. The presence of Alara changes the stakes for the escape. Before, Bjorn only wanted to return home to save his throne. Now, he wants to escape to save her as well. The next morning, Alara provides Bjorn with information about the surrounding lands that she remembers from her childhood, giving the Vikings a map in their minds that they previously lacked. The tension in the camp reaches a boiling point when Silas decides to sell Alara to a different buyer. The prospect of losing her pushes Bjorn to his limit. He realizes that the philosophical debates with King Edward were useless. The only truth in this land is the one he can create with his own hands. He and Floki begins to organize the other slaves secretly during night, using the skills they learned as warriors and builders. Bjorn tells Alara to be ready, promising her that the next time they see the sun, they will be moving towards the sea. The time in the slave market becomes a turning point in Bjorn's life. He was understanding how the powerful oppress the weaker ones. He loses the last of his youthful arrogance and replaces it with a cold, calculated focus. He no longer fights for his father's dream or for a golden crown. He fights for the people standing next to him in the mud. Alara becomes his primary motivation. Her presence humanizes the Viking who had once only thought of silver and gold. As they prepare to strike against Silas and his guards, Bjorn feels a different kind of power than he felt as a king. He is a man who has lost everything and has nothing left to fear, making him more dangerous than any army King Edward could ever assemble. The struggle in the slave camp was a daily battle for survival. The Vikings face heat, thirst, and the constant threat of Silas's whip. On top of that, everyday rich white people visited to buy slaves. Each day felt like a blessing. Bjorn was actually hoping for someone to buy him so that he can crack his owner's skull later and free himself. However, the bond between Bjorn, Floki, and Alara creates a small kingdom of their own within the confines of the camp, and the other prisoners treated him like a leader. They share their meager rations and protect each other from the guards' cruelty. Bjorn learns from Alara that the English people are just as oppressed by their kings as the Vikings are by their climate. This realization softens his view of the world, though it does not weaken his resolve to escape. He knows that his path home is still long and filled with hardship, but for the first time since leaving Denmark, he feels he has a reason to live that is his own, rather than a legacy forced upon him by his father. The time for whispers in the mud finally ends when Silas decides to make an example of a young, weakened slave. Bjorn decides that he can no longer wait for the perfect moment. As Silas raises his whip, Bjorn lunges forward and he uses the iron links to strangle the nearest guard. This sparks a violent revolution within the group. The slaves, inspired by Bjorn's sheer ferocity, pick up stones and mining picks to turn on their captors. Bjorn shows his bravery by charging directly at Silas's personal guard, taking several shallow spear wounds to his chest and arms without slowing down. He moves like a man who has forgotten the meaning of pain, his only goal being to clear a path for Alara and Floki. However, the chaos of the uprising leads to a tragic and bloody event. During the frantic escape, a group of Silas's mercenaries traps a section of the slaves near the edge of the shelter. In the crossfire of crossbow bolts and swinging blades, Bjorn sees Silas himself aiming a heavy iron mace at Alara. Bjorn throws himself in the way, taking a devastating blow to his ribs that leaves him coughing up blood. In the madness that follows, Silas is eventually overwhelmed by the mob, but the cost was high. As the slaves scatter into the nearby woods to avoid the approaching English reinforcements, a heavy gate falls, separating the group. Floki gets pushed one way by a surge of fleeing prisoners, while Bjorn and Alara are forced in the opposite direction. Bjorn screams for his friend, but the sound of clashing steel and all the noise buries his voice. For the first time since leaving Denmark, the two friends are truly apart. Bjorn feels very bad, like his heart is sinking. Bjorn and Alara flees deep into the forest. Bjorn was losing a lot of blood from the mace strike and the spear wounds. Alara has to wrap her arms around his waist to keep him upright, her own clothes stained with his blood. She asks him why he risked himself for her. Bjorn smirks and replies that it would be a nice story to tell their kids and grandkids. Alara blushes and then asks him what would they do next. Bjorn assures her that he knows how to survive in the woods. Thus, they wanders for a day and a night in the jungle, trying to get as far as possible from the English settlement. Just as Bjorn's strength finally fails and he collapses into the ferns, they find themselves surrounded by a group of people dressed in furs and painted with blue ink. It was a local tribe, descendants of the ancient Britons who live on the fringes of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. They does not speak Nordic dialect or English, but they recognizes the marks of a slave on their necks. The tribe takes them to a hidden settlement deep within a rocky hill. They provides Bjorn with herbal medicines and bitter teas that helps to stop his internal bleeding. During the weeks of recovery, Bjorn and Alara grow much closer. Without the constant threat of Silas or the pressure of a throne, Bjorn begins to talk to Alara about his life in Ribe. He confesses that he was a boy playing at being a king, and that he never understood the weight of a life until he saw his men die in the valley. In return, Alara tells him about her father's hall and the songs her mother used to sing. In the quiet of the forest, they find a rare kind of peace. Bjorn realizes that he loves Alara not just because she is beautiful, but because she saw him at his absolute lowest point and did not turn away. She really cared for him. The tribe had their own weird ways of life. What Bjorn and Alara enjoyed the most was how they danced every night around the fire. That kind of celebration was done once in a while by the Vikings, and never by the English nobles. For a few days they stays there in peace, but then their peace is shattered when a scouting party of English soldiers discovers the tribe's location. The soldiers are part of King Edward's elite trackers, still hunting for the high-value Viking prisoner. The tribe tries to hide them, but the English use fire to smoke out the ravine. The soldiers are led by a captain named Joseph, who knows that Thomas wants Bjorn alive for the ransom. As the huts begins to burn, Bjorn grabs a discarded hunting spear. He was still weak, but his bravery returns the moment he sees Alara in danger. He throws the spear and kills the first two soldiers who enter the clearing in one shot, giving the tribespeople time to flee, but he knew that they cannot win a direct fight. The chase begins in the dense, rain-soaked woods. The English soldiers had the advantage of horses and fresh supplies, while Bjorn and Alara were traveling on foot through rough terrain. Bjorn uses every trick he knew to slow them down, creating false trails and hiding their tracks in streambeds. He tells Alara that she must keep moving, even if he has to stay behind to hold the line. She refuses, telling him that she has already lost one home and she will not lose him. Bjorn accepts defeat and runs with her. The English soldiers utilizes their military discipline to hunt them. They spread out in a wide arc, slowly pushing Bjorn and Alara towards a steep cliff edge above a stream of river. Captain Joseph calls Bjorn, promising him that if he surrenders, the girl will be spared. Bjorn knew very well that this is a lie. He remembers Thomas's betrayal all too well. He looks at Alara and then at the churning water below. He realizes that the only way to survive is to take a leap that most men would consider as a suicide. Just as the soldiers gets near them and raises their crossbow, Bjorn takes Alara's hand. He tells her to trust him and to hold her breath. With the English soldiers only a few feet away, the pair jumps from the cliff. The fall was terrifyingly long, and they hits the cold water with a force that nearly knocks them out. The river was swollen from the recent rains, and the current was violent. The English soldiers stands at the edge of the cliff, firing bolts into the water, but the violent stream hides their target. Joseph tells his men that they won't survive that fall. He was worried, thinking that Thomas would be really mad. They leaves. But it was not the end for the Viking. Bjorn struggles to keep Alara's head above the water as they are swept downstream. He strikes his shoulder against a submerged rock and starts bleeding again, but he still refuses to let go of Alara's hand. He just wanted to keep her alive at all cost. They ends up miles away from the cliffside, eventually washing up on a muddy bank far to the south of the land. Bjorn drags Alara onto the grass, both of them shivering. When Alara sees how badly Bjorn was bleeding, she panics and cries. Her hard composure finally crumbles. Bjorn tells her that he will survive and gets up with his hand on the wound. They were now in a part of England that neither of them recognizes, and they have no weapons, no food, and no idea where Floki might be. Bjorn looks at his bruised hands and his tattered clothes, then back at the woman who chose to jump into the abyss with him. He tells her that the English will not stop hunting them, but he also tells her that he has never felt more like a king than he does right now and laughs. Alara also smiles with teary eyes and asks him if all the Vikings are mad like him. Bjorn replies that not all but the kings. He promises Alara that he will find a way back to the sea, and when he does, he will return to Denmark not just to reclaim his crown, but to bring an army that will ensure no one ever puts a collar on her again. The conversation was quiet and grim, but there was a new steel in Bjorn's voice. The past few months had taught him a lot more than he knew in his entire life. He looks up at the sky and wonders if his father is watching him. Bjorn and Alara walks for many days until they find a small, abandoned stone hut near the southern coast. The air around there was warmer, and the sound of the sea was a constant. Bjorn tells Alara that they must stay there to let his wounds fully heal before they try to find a ship. He explains that they are far from the king's main roads and that the tall grass will hide them from passing scouts. Alara replies that she feels a strange sense of peace in that lonely place. Inside the hut, they lit a small fire. The space was cramped and smells of dry earth and salt. Bjorn tells Alara that he often thinks about his home in Ribe, but the images are starting to fade slowly. He admits that the face of his sister and the voice of his mother feel like a distant memory now. Alara replies by reaching out and touching the scars on his chest. She tells him that the boy who came to England is long gone, and the man standing in front of her is someone much stronger. In the heat of the fire and the silence of the coast, their bond moves beyond words. Bjorn tells her that he wants her to be more than a companion in his escape. He explains that she is the only reason his heart still beats with hope. Alara replies by pulling him closer. She tells him that she chose to jump off the cliff not just to escape the soldiers, but to stay with him. They share an intimate night together. Their bodies connect in new ways. It is a moment of physical connection that has nothing to do with kings or slaves. Only two people finding warmth in a cold night. The next morning, Bjorn stands by the water, looking at the horizon. He tells Alara that there is still no sign of Floki. He expresses his fear that his friend might be dead or locked in a cage even worse than the one they left. He explains that Floki is the only one who can build the path back to Denmark, and he is also his sister's lover. Alara replies that she does not know much, but from what she has observed, Floki is a man of the woods, and the sea and the gods will protect him. She tells Bjorn that a man who knows the secrets of the trees is harder to kill than a warrior with a sword. She encourages him to believe that they will see the shipbuilder again. While they hide in the south, King Edward was getting mad in his palace. He tells his commanders that the escape of the Viking king is an insult to his crown. He explains them that Bjorn is a symbol of resistance that must be crushed before other Northmen are encouraged to raid to English lands. The king tells Thomas that if Bjorn is not found, Thomas will lose his lands and his head. Thomas with fear replies that he has trackers in every village and spies in every port. He explains that no Viking can stay hidden in England forever because their red hair and foreign tongue always give them away. Back in Ribe, the atmosphere was dark and tense. Queen Erica sits on the throne, her face thin and tired. She tells the local elders that she knows her son is still alive because she hasn't seen his spirit in her dreams. She explains that the kingdom is under threat from rival lords who believe the Erickson line is finished. Helga stands by the window, looking at the empty docks where the 6 ships once sat. She tells her mother that she is starting to lose hope. She has told to the scouts that she will not marry any nominee for the throne because she is still waiting for Floki to return and claim her hand. Back at the stone hut, Bjorn spends his days sharpening a piece of iron he found. He tells Alara that they cannot stay there for much longer. He explains that the winter is coming, and the hut will not protect them from the frost. He tells her that he plans to steal a fishing boat from a nearby village. Alara replies that she knows how to read the stars in that part of the country. She tells him that she can guide them to a hidden cove where the merchant ships often dock for repairs. Bjorn tells her that he is worried about her safety if they are caught again. He explains that he would rather die than see her back in Silas's chains. Alara replies that she is no longer afraid of dying. She tells him that she has already lived a full life in the few weeks they have spent together in the forest and the hut. She explains that she is ready to be a Viking's wife and face whatever storm is coming. Bjorn looks at her and tells her that she is the true queen of his heart. He explains that when they return to Rebay, he will build her a hall that rivals the King of Wessex's palace. Alara replies with a gentle smile that she does not need a hall or gold. She explains that she only wants to see the land where the sun stays up all night, the place he described during their long marches. As they prepare to leave their sanctuary, a distant horn sounds from the hills. Bjorn tells Alara to get down and hide in the tall grass. He explains that the sound belongs to the king's cavalry. He tells her that the hunt has finally reached the coast. Alara replies him that they will not be taken alive this time. Bjorn tells her to follow him toward the cliffs. He explains that the only way forward is through the danger they have been trying to avoid. They leave the hut behind, moving like shadows toward the sea, while the English soldiers close the circle around them. Bjorn and Alara move stealthily through the coastal marshlands, avoiding the main paths where the king's cavalry patrols. Bjorn tells Alara that they must find a place where the wood is thick and the ground is firm enough to support a heavy weight. He explains that he feels a strange pull toward a secluded cove hidden by jagged limestone cliffs. Alara replies that she sees smoke rising from a narrow ravine near the water's edge. She tells him that the smoke is thin and blue, coming from a fire fueled by seasoned oak, not wet brush. As they crawl through the undergrowth, Bjorn sees a familiar figure hunched over a skeletal wooden frame. He tells Alara to stay back while he moves closer to confirm what he sees. Bjorn steps into the clearing and calls out a name he hasn't spoken in months. Floki freezes, then slowly turns around with a look of disbelief on his weary face. Floki replies that he thought that his best friend is dead in that foreign land. He explains that he has been hiding in this cove for 3 moons, working in secret to build something that can carry them across the channel. The reunion was emotional but brief, as the danger was still close. Floki tells Bjorn that he managed to escape the slave march by surviving a deadly fever and rolling into a ditch during a moonless night. Bjorn tells Floki that he and Alara have grown close, and she is the reason he survived the journey through the forest. Floki replies to Alara with a respectful nod that if she is the one who kept the King of Denmark alive, then she has the spirit of a Valkyrie. Alara smiles and thanks Floki. She tells him how much Bjorn missed him. Then Bjorn asks about the progress of the boat. Floki replies by pointing toward the center of the cove. He explains that it is not a grand longship like the ones they lost, but a small vessel designed for speed and shallow waters. He tells Bjorn that he has been looking for iron rivets from shipwrecks and using animal hides to seal the hull. Floki explains that the boat is nearly finished, but he lacks a proper sail and enough dried meat for the crossing. Bjorn tells Floki that they will find what is needed. He explains that the English soldiers are nearby and that their time is running out. Floki replies that the boat is strong enough to handle the tides if they pick the right wind. He tells Bjorn that he has crafted a new T-shaped keel using a single piece of ancient oak he found half buried in the sand. The 3 of them begins to work with a renewed sense of hope. Bjorn tells Alara that they must help Floki gather the final materials. He explains that while Floki works on the steering oar, they will hunt for food and gather wool from the local wild sheep to weave some warm clothes. Alara replies that she can use her knowledge of the local plants to create a dye that will darken the sail, making it invisible against the night sea. She tells Bjorn that she is ready to leave this land behind and start a new life in the north with him. While they work, Floki tells Bjorn about the movements of King Edward's men. He explains that he has seen the English scouts patrolling the cliffs above the cove every few days. He tells Bjorn that the king is desperate because the common people are starting to tell stories about the Viking who cannot be caught by Edward. Bjorn replies that the king's desperation is their greatest advantage. He explains that an angry hunter makes more mistakes than a patient one. As the sun begins to set, they finally pushes the boat into the shallow water. Floki tells Bjorn that the oars are balanced. He explains that they must wait for the tide to turn before they can row out. Bjorn tells Alara to climb into the center of the boat and stay low. He explains that once they hit the open water, the wind will be their only protector. Alara replies that she is not afraid of the water as long as she is with them. Bjorn looks at the horizon and tells Floki that they are finally going home. He explains that he can almost feel the cold air of Rebay on his skin. Floki replies that the gods have tested them, but they have not broken. He tells Bjorn that a king who has lost everything and built it back with his own hands is a king worth following. They stand together on the small deck, watching the stars appear. Alara then reveals that she knows the language of the stars and can lead them towards their destination. Floki praise her for that. Bjorn tells them to take their positions. He explains that the journey home begins with a single stroke of the oar. All three of them could feel the weight of the tide striking their boat. Bjorn tells his companions that they will not look back at the English shore again. He explains that their future lies to the east across the North Sea. Floki replies by handing Bjorn the steering oar that a king should lead his people home. Bjorn takes the wood in his hands and guides the small boat out of the cove, leaving the nightmare of England behind. On the other hand, Edward was losing his mind upon hearing that they have escaped. He gives Thomas one last chance. Thomas ponders for hours and comes up with a plan. The small boat travels far into the open sea, but the weather quickly turns against them. Bjorn tells Floki that the sky is turning into a dark purple and the wind is shifting too fast. He explains that the waves are becoming taller than the mast. Floki replies that the boat is strong, but it is not built for a great storm of the North Sea if it comes to that. He tells Bjorn to grip the steering oar with all his might while he and Alara try to bail out the freezing water. The storm hits them with a fury that cracks the wooden hull. Bjorn tells his companions to hold onto the ropes as a massive wave flips the vessel into the churning white foam. The boat Floki built with so much dedication gets destroyed by the storm right in front of them. Bjorn grabs Alara's hand and tries to keep her close while floating. Floki cries and asks Thor if he made a mistake. They swims for as long as possible. They wash up on the sandy shores of a small green island as the sun begins to rise. Bjorn tells Alara to wake up. His voice was a bit cracking from swallowing salt water. He explains that they are alive, but the boat is in pieces across the rocks. Floki crawls onto the sand and looks at the wreckage. He tells Bjorn that the wood is shattered, and he cannot fix it without a proper forge and months of time. He explains that they are stranded once again. Alara replies that she sees smoke from a village nearby and suggests they hide their Viking clothes. They travels further into the island and finds a small town in there. The people of the island were simple farmers and fishers who lived under the rule of King Edward, but they were far from the politics of the mainland. An old village elder finds them and offers them soup and dry blankets. Bjorn tells the elder that they are simple travelers from the north whose merchant ships sank in the storm. He explains that they are looking for work to earn their passage home. The elder replies that the island is peaceful and they are welcome to stay as long as they help with the harvest. Bjorn and Floki stays under cover, working in the fields and keeping their heads low. For a few weeks, they live a quiet life, and Bjorn tells Alara that he could almost forget he was once a king. They were living peacefully doing farming and cooking, however. The peace gets shattered when a large English unit appears in the harbor. Bjorn tells Floki to gather their hidden weapons as he recognizes the banners of Wessex. He explains that the king's men have finally tracked them to even a remote island. Thomas steps off the ship, flanked by a unit of 20 armored soldiers. Thomas tells the villagers that it is heard that they are harboring dangerous criminals and a pagan king. He explains that anyone who helps the Vikings will be hanged for treason. The village elder replies to Thomas that he only sees 3 tired travelers who have worked hard for their bread. He tells the soldiers that the island people do not care for the king's wars and will not hand over their guests. Thomas grows angry and orders his soldiers to burn the village storehouse to force the Vikings out. The villagers, fueled by a sense of fairness and a hatred for the king's high taxes, grabs their pickaxe and fishing spears to protect Bjorn and his friends. Bjorn tells the elder that this is not their fight, but the old man replies that a guest under their roof is sacred, as told by Jesus. A brutal combat begins in the center of the village. The English soldiers use their heavy steel swords to cut through the villagers' wooden tools. Bjorn and Floki joins the battle with their rusted axes to push the soldiers back. Bjorn was fighting the soldiers while guarding the villagers who lacked experience. At the height of the struggle, a young soldier aims a heavy crossbow at Bjorn's back while he was busy fighting 2 other men. Floki sees the movement and screams at Bjorn. Bjorn tells the story later that Floki did not hesitate for a single second. Floki throws himself in front of Bjorn just as the soldier releases the bolt. The iron-tipped arrow sinks deep into Floki's chest. Floki falls to his knees, gasping for air. Bjorn roars so loud that all the soldiers halts for a brief minute. His voice shaking with a mix of grief and horror, he asks Floki why did he do it. He catches his friend before he hits the dirt. Floki replies to Bjorn with a bloody smile that the boat was finished anyway, and that Bjorn must be the one to reach the shores of Denmark. He explains that he can see the great hall of the gods, and that All-Father Odin himself is waiting for him to join them in the feast there. With a final, rattling breath, the great boat builder closes his eyes. A cold, terrifying silence falls over the village. Bjorn tells Alara to step back. He explains to the English soldiers that they have just made the final mistake of their lives. A primal rage takes over Bjorn, turning him into a monster. He picks up Floki's heavy smithing hammer and his own notched axe. Bjorn tells the soldiers that no more villagers will die, but only Englishmen. He charges the unit with a speed that defies his size. He wipes out the front rank in a single sweep, his axe splitting shields and helmets like they are made of paper. The English soldiers, who were once confident, begins to feel a deep, paralyzing fear. They tell each other to form a circle, but Bjorn breaks through their line like a wolf in a sheep herd. He throws away his shield and uses his bare hands and his rage to demolish his enemies. He kills the soldiers one by one, his clothes becoming completely soaked in the blood of his enemies. Thomas tries to run back towards the ship, but Bjorn throws a spear that pins the merchant's cloak to a wooden post. Bjorn finishes the rest of the unit, leaving 19 bodies in the mud. By the end of the battle, he was the only one standing. Bjorn walks slowly towards Thomas, who was trembling and begging for his life. Thomas tells Bjorn that he was only following orders, and that he can offer him more gold than he ever dreamed of. He explains that he can help Bjorn get a new ship if he just lets him live. Bjorn replies by grabbing Thomas by the throat and lifting him off the ground that gold cannot bring back Floki or the hundreds of men who died in the valley. He explains that Thomas is no longer a man in his eyes, but a debt that must be paid as soon as possible. Bjorn does not kill Thomas immediately. Instead, he binds Thomas's hands with the same heavy ropes the villagers use for their fishing nets. He tells the survivors of the village that he is sorry for the blood spilled on their land. The elder replies that they are honored to have fought alongside a true warrior. He tells Bjorn that they have a small, sturdy fishing boat that is fully stocked and ready for the sea. He explains that it is a gift from the island to the king of the north. Bjorn, Elara, and the captive Thomas move toward the docks. Bjorn tells Elara that they must carry Floki's body onto the boat. He explains that his friend will not be buried in English dirt, but will be given to the sea according to the old ways. Elara replies that she will help him row until their hands bleed. She promises him that they will give his best friend an honorable funeral. The villagers provides them all the important items for survival. Floki had done one last miracle before leaving them forever. He had fixed the boat in such a short time. As they departs from the island, Bjorn looks at Thomas, who was tied and thrown to the back of the boat, and tells the traitor that he is going to see the land of the Vikings again. He explains that he will be the one to tell the people of Ribe how he betrayed them and killed all the Vikings, and then how King Bjorn slaughtered an entire army of them. Thomas tries to reply, but Bjorn tells him to be silent for his own sake. He explains that the only voice he wants to hear is the sound of the wind and the waves. With Floki's body wrapped in a clean shroud and the English merchant as his prisoner, Bjorn sets the course for the east. He tells Elara that the Erickson line is not finished yet, and that Denmark will soon hear the roar of an Erickson again. Bjorn, Elara, and the captive Thomas travels across the open sea for many days, but the journey becomes a grueling test of endurance. Bjorn stands at the bow of the small fishing boat. His eyes scans the horizon for any sign of land, but there was nothing. He tells Elara that their food has completely run out, and their water vessels hold nothing but dry air. He explains that his throat burns with every breath, and his hands are so raw from rowing that the wood of the oar is stained with his own blood. Elara replies that she can feel her heart slowing down from the hunger. She tells him that her eyes are playing tricks on her, making her see phantom towers and stone walls in the distant mists. Bjorn tells her to have faith in the old gods, because Odin does not guide a king through the dungeons of England just to let him starve in an empty sea, he says. He reaches into his leather pouch and pulls out a small, rectangular crystal that he had managed to keep hidden from the English guards and the slave trader. He tells Elara that this is a sunstone, a piece of Iceland spar that Floki gave him before they ever left the shores of Ribe. He explains that even when the sky is completely covered by thick, dark storm clouds, this stone can catch the hidden rays of light and reveal the exact position of the sun. Bjorn holds the clear crystal up to his eye, turning it slowly until the stone changes color, blinking with a bright yellow hue. He tells her that the stone shows the sun is directly to their south, which means their current heading is taking them exactly where they need to go. He explains that the gods are helping them through a stone to help them reach home. Thomas tells Bjorn that the sunstone is nothing but pagan magic and that they are going to die in the cold water. He explains that the Christian god has abandoned them because of the blood Bjorn spilled on the island. Bjorn replies to the merchant with a cold chuckle and replies that it sounds like the English god relies on stone walls and books, but the Norse gods ride upon the very wind that is pushing their small boat. He explains that Thor's hammer is in the thunder they heard last night, and Njord is the one controlling the currents beneath their keel. As the afternoon sun begins to dip below the horizon, the thick sea fog suddenly splits apart like a torn sail. Bjorn tells Elara to drop her oar and look straight ahead. He explains that the dark line rising from the water is not a bank of clouds, but the solid, sandy cliffs of Jutland. He tells her that the specific smell of the pine trees and the damp earth carried by the wind belongs to only one place in the entire world. He explains that the long, painful journey is finally over because the land they are looking at is Denmark. Alara stares at it with tears in her eyes, her face breaking into a wide smile despite her cracked lips. She tells him that she can finally see the great forest he spoke about during their nights in the slave hut. Bjorn guides the small fishing boat closer to the shoreline, entering a deep, familiar fjord that cuts into the mainland. He tells Alara to look at the harbor ahead, where several massive longships are moored against the wooden piers. He explains that these are the war vessels of his own people, built with the high prows and overlapping oak planks that only the Northmen know how to fashion. He tells her that the banners flying from the masts bear the mark of the Erickson family, meaning his mother, Queen Erica, has managed to hold the kingdom together despite the rumors of his death. He explains that the gods have kept the throne warm for his return. Thomas looks at the approaching ships and begins to weep, realizing that he is about to step into the hornet's nest that he tried to destroy. Thomas tells Bjorn that he will give him all his secret wealth in England if Bjorn just drops him off on a deserted beach. He explains that the Viking warriors will tear him to pieces if they find out he was the one who led their king into King Edward's trap. Bjorn replies that Thomas's life does not belong to him anymore, but to the families of the 100 warriors who never came back from the English Valley. He explains that Thomas will be a living lesson to any foreigner who thinks a Viking can be bought or sold. The small fishing boat slides into the shallow waters of the harbor of Ripe, its hull scraping against the pebbles of the beach. A group of Viking guards, armed with round shields and heavy iron spears, runs down from the watchtowers to confront the strange, tattered vessel. The lead guard calls out a warning, demanding to know who they are and why they arrive in a broken English fishing boat. Bjorn stands up on the prow, his tall frame creating a silhouette before the sun. He tells the guards to lower their spears and look closely at his face. Alara tells the Vikings that the king they thought was dead has returned from the enemy land to reclaim his seat. The guards freezes in astonishment. Their weapons drops on the sand as they recognize the icy blue eyes and the authoritative voice of Bjorn Erickson. The lead guard tells the others to sound the great bronze horns to alert the royal hall. He explains to Bjorn that the entire village has been mourning him for a year, and that rival clans were planning to invade the hall by the next full moon. Bjorn replies that the rivals are too late because the Erickson line is still unbroken. He tells the guards to take Thomas and bind him to the central post in the market square, explaining that the merchant needs to be kept alive for the judgment that is to come. Alara steps off the boat, her feet sinking into the soil of Denmark for the very first time. Bjorn takes her hand and tells the gathering crowd that she is not a captive or a servant, but the woman who saved their king's life in the forests of Wessex. He explains that she jumped from a cliff with him and survived the cruelty of the slave camps by his side. The villagers look at her with respect, seeing the strength in her posture despite her exhausted body. Alara replies to the crowd with a bowed head that she is honored. She also tells Bjorn in a whisper that the air here feels different, cleaner than the air of England. She tells him that she finally understands why he was so desperate to return to this land. As they walk up the wooden path toward the great hall, the heavy doors swings open, and Queen Erica steps out into the firelight. She was wearing her finest woolen dress, but her hand axe was still tucked into her leather belt. She stops at the top of the stone steps, her eyes locking onto her son at once. Erica wipes her tears and tells Bjorn that she knew the sea could not hold him because the Norns had told her his saga was not yet finished. She explains that she has spent every night praying to Freya for his return, even when the elders told her to choose a new successor. Bjorn replies by walking up the steps and embracing his mother, his heavy armor clinking against her jewelry. He tells her that her warnings about England were true, but his faith in the gods and the strength of his arms brought him back through the fire and storm. Helga runs out from behind her mother, her eyes scanning the path behind Bjorn. She looks at the empty space where Floki should be standing and her face falls into a sudden grief. Helga tells Bjorn that she does not see the boat builder anywhere. She begs him to tell her that Floki is just tending to the boat or securing the ropes at the docks. Bjorn looks down at the wooden floor, his voice turning quiet and heavy. He tells Helga that Floki is with their ancestors in Valhalla. He explains that her lover died with a weapon in his hand, throwing his own body in front of an arrow to save his king. He tells her that Floki's last thoughts were of her and the shores of Rebe. Helga drops to her knees, weeping openly as the realization hits her. But she does not curse her brother. She replies that a death in battle is the only way a great builder like Floki would want to leave this world. She tells Bjorn that she will weave a great tapestry to honor his memory, so that the children of Denmark will always know the name of the man who built the ships that crossed the violent sea. Bjorn tells her that Floki's hammer will be placed in the royal treasury as a sacred relic of their people. He explains that as long as the Erickson name rules Denmark, Floki's legacy will never be forgotten. The villagers gather inside the Great Hall, lighting the massive central lamp that warms and illuminates the entire hall. Bjorn sits on his father's high chair, with Alara sitting on a bench by his side. He tells his people the entire story of his sea adventure, from the betrayal of Thomas to the philosophical debates with King Edward and the brutal revolution in the slave camps. He explains that England is a land of advanced tools and organization, but it lacks the enduring spirit that the old gods give to the Northmen. He tells them that his desire for simple conquest is gone, replaced now by a deep understanding of what it means to protect his home. The conversation lasts until the early hours of the morning, the simple words of the king restoring the confidence of a nation that had thought itself lost. Bjorn looks at the fire and tells Alara that their long homecoming is finally complete. The morning after his return, Bjorn orders the entire village to gather on the rocky shore for Floki's final send-off. He tells the warriors to prepare a small, elegant burial ship, the last piece of craftsmanship that Floki himself had touched before the storm. He explains that a man who lived by the seas and the tides must be returned to the water with the highest honors of the Norse people. The villagers place Floki's body on the deck, dressed in clean linen with his favorite iron hammer resting across his chest. Helga steps forward and places a beautifully woven cloak over his shoulders, telling her brother that she has stitched the runes for a safe journey to Valhalla into the fabric. Bjorn stands by the water's edge, holding a burning pitch torch high above his head. He tells the crowd that Floki was not just a great builder but a true friend. He explains that without Floki's genius and his flexible hulls, no Northman would have ever tasted the wealth of foreign shores or seen the sun rise over the western sea. He tells his people that Odin has opened the doors of the Great Hall for a true master of the craft. With a sudden movement, Bjorn throws the torch onto the oiled wood of the vessel. The oarsman pushes the burning ship out into the deep water, and the villagers watch in silence as the flames lick the sky, turning the ship into a floating mountain of fire against the gray morning mist. As the smoke from the funeral ship fades into the horizon, Bjorn walks back towards the harbor with Alara by his side. He looks at the 4 remaining large warships anchored at the port. Bjorn tells Alara that his heart feels a strange emotion as he stares out at the open ocean. He explains that while the slave camps and the dungeons of Wessex had broken his youthful arrogance, they had also shown him the true value of what lies across the water. He tells her that King Edward's stone walls and organized armies are formidable, but they are not invincible. He reaches into his jute bag and pulls out the sunstone once again, the crystal catching the sharp morning light. Bjorn tells Alara that the betrayal of Thomas and the technological traps of the English have taught him how his enemies thinks. He explains that he is no longer the foolish boy who sailed with only 6 ships into a blind valley. He tells her that the next time the dragon-headed ships leave Denmark, they will not go as raiders, but as an unstoppable force of conquest, something that his father Ivar truly dreamt of. He explains that he owes a debt to Floki and to the 300 men whose bones are still resting in the English mud. Alara looks at the steel in his eyes and replies that she will help him prepare for that day. She tells him that she knows the weak points in the English defenses better than any merchant and that she will guide his army to the heart of Wessex. Bjorn smiles, his hand tightening around the handle of his father's sword. He tells his mother, Queen Erica, who is watching from the hall steps, that the dream of England did not die in the valley. He explains that the fire that consumed Floki's ship has just sparked a much larger fire inside his own soul, and that the North Sea will soon belong to the Ericksons once again. After all, that is the Viking way of life.